quería puntualizar un poco, para finiquitar el tema, justo lo que ha dicho Yago ¿no? En la última intervención y lo que estabais un poco comentando, creo que al final hemos llegado un poco a la conclusión de lo que hay que resignificar no es radical, sino democracia, ¿no? Porque al final estábamos hablando un poco de eso, radical me suena muy fuerte, pero al final yo justo que estaba apuntando es un poco rollo democracia, ¿no? Que somos como radicalmente democráticos, ¿no? Entonces, al final el ejercicio que tenemos que hacer es cómo introducir a la gente el concepto de democracia, que realmente es este que tenemos aquí, aunque ahora lo llamemos radical democracia, porque lo que tenemos actualmente es un sucedáneo bastante, ¿no? Pues eso. Uh-huh. Justo, justo, justo.
Como de la historia de la democracia que no se sabe. Es que somos muy incultos, o sea, que hemos crecido, bueno, yo nací ya en democracia, o sea, no sé ni, o sea, para mí es una palabra como muy del día a día, o sea, no, o sea, está como muy familiarizada, pero, o sea, todo lo que contaba Yago de cómo era la Grecia, que a propósito me estoy leyendo un libro griego, es como muy bueno también, o sea, cuenta precisamente todo esto, que es muy interesante, y entonces me imagino que el típico youtuber que te lo explica, ¿sabes? En plan de, aquí el youtuber de la democracia, en plan de, pues te voy a explicar todo esto para que entendáis de lo que estáis viviendo y así.
Es como dibujando, ¿verdad? Hello friends, amigos, estamos en streaming. Es un placer presentar a John Jordan del Laboratory of Insurrectional Imagination. Ha venido desde Nantes, él vive en Sat, en la comuna que hay cerca de Nantes. Y bueno, tiene un larguísimo recorrido en imaginación política, vinculando activismo, arte. Y bueno, si nos podemos poner un poquito más adelante para... Y bueno, well, thank you, welcome. Thank you so much for being in Madrid. So, it's your time.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. And then we have time for questions. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, Bernardo, for the invitation. And for making the big compromise, which was not to separate my ethics from my aesthetics. As Wittgenstein said, there is no difference between aesthetics and ethics. So I haven't flown for 15 years. I work as a climate activist. It would be a bit like an anti-slavery activist having slaves at home while he goes to go and do talks about slavery. So thank you for facilitating that. For me, climate is a question of democracy and commons. If I had flown from France to here, I would use about 0.2 tons of carbon dioxide, which is about 1 year worth of carbon dioxide emissions for someone who lives in Nepal. So those, I don't know how long it takes, maybe 35 minutes, whatever. It would be 1 year of someone in Nepal. So for me, it's also a question of climate justice, of how much rights we have to pollute. A lot of our work is about the body, and it begins with the body. And I just wanted to try a little exercise, seeing as we've been sitting down a lot on our asses. So I just want to try a little exercise with you. I'm going to ask a few questions, and if the answer to the question is yes, can you stand up and stay standing up? Okay. So first question is, if there are any people who identify themselves as women and who have ever worn trousers at least once in their life, can they stand up? Great. Okay. If there are anyone who was part of a union, can you stand up? Is there anyone who's ever used contraception? Can be the pill, condoms, not coitus interruptus, that doesn't count. Stand up. Okay, now I could have gone on, I could have said, is there anyone who had taken a weekend, could you stand up, etc. Even I could have asked, is there anyone who has used a bicycle when they were a child to stand up? So what do you have in common? You are? People. This is true. We're people, we're bacteria, we're many things. This is true. But it's not the right answer. Any other ideas for the answer? Huh? You choose things? The answer is that every single one of these things that we take for granted as banal were won because of disobedience. You can sit down now. So all these things were won because people broke laws. People broke laws to have the right. Women were killed because they wore trousers. Emma Goldman went to prison because she gave leaflets that explained contraception to the poor in New York. People went to prison, people died because of having these, what we now see as rights. And Oscar Wilde says very beautifully, disobedience in the eyes of anyone who has read history is our original virtue. It is through disobedience and rebellion that progress has been made. So it's quite hard to be here in Spain, because I live in France. And right now in France, something's happening. So it's been very hard to concentrate. I had insurrection insomnia last night. I couldn't sleep because I was like, fuck, what am I doing in Spain? I should be going back to France. and I have to stay here for like 5 days. So, and what is happening in France is quite extraordinary. It's a grassroots revolt. And it's a grassroots revolt that breaks all the codes. The only code that it has is a color code, which is yellow. But all the other codes are broken. It came without, and like all true revolutions or insurrections, it totally doesn't conform to all the imaginings we had before of what a grassroots popular insurrection might look like in France. There are no parties involved, there are no activists involved at the origin, there were no unions involved. It really came from the bottom. And it all began with a rebellion against a carbon tax. So it began with a climate question. It began because there was a carbon tax on diesel fuel, and the French government, which is far from ecological, which has a kind of, like many governments, a greenwashing government, uses this climate-friendly discourse, but of course doesn't tax airplane fuel, it's financing petrol companies, and is, of course, continuing to push the ecocidal system of a growth economy. But it began like this.
Previously on AMC's The Walking Dead.
And last Saturday, it was this.
Monsieur Macron. Bon, Monsieur Macron, c'est le représentant,
So Mr.
évidemment,
Macron is a
comme on le voit
representative
ici sur les
of the
pancartes,
rich.
comme on le voit partout en France, c'est le représentant des riches, des gens très riches,
The very
des gens,
rich.
des grands banquiers, des grands
big
capitalistes,
bankers,
pas le boulanger du
the big
coin, pas
capitalists,
la
not the
personne qui
baker,
a son petit
not
magasin.
the shopkeeper,
Non, les très gros
all
capitalistes
the big
qui, eux,
capitalists.
voient leur profit augmenter d'une façon démesurée
And he's
au détriment de l'ensemble de la société. C'est
unmeasured
ça qui n'est
profit.
pas juste. Alors oui, aujourd'hui, il y a une véritable question sur le pouvoir d'achat, sur nos conditions de vie, ici et ailleurs.
Merci, voilà, vous l'avez entendu, un des revendications.
Voilà, merci Nivi, non, je vous coupe parce que vous voyez cette image-là, on est au pied de l'Arc de Triomphe, les gilets jaunes triompheront est-il écrit sur l'Arc de Triomphe. Laura Pouget, vous avez une vue d'ensemble, ça dégénère totalement là.
So this is all at the bottom of the Arc de Triomphe.
Force de l'ordre.
So imagine a kind of very potent cocktail of the movement of the squares, the M15 movements, Occupy, Arab Spring, plus kind of ancient folk revolts against the king, ancient tax revolts, and very much a revolt of the rural disenfranchised against the metropolitan hipsters. That's really very much also what it's fundamentally about the rural world and against the metropolitan world. And it's a genius use of a meme and an object. And the object is, of course, the yellow vest. In France, every car has to have a yellow vest. It's a law. And so it was an absolute genius. It was a Facebook video of a guy, a truck driver, who just said, look, we should have a color code. We all have a vest. And this vest, of course, has become the best meme ever. It's a vest where, in a way, a bit like the Zapatistas always said, we wear masks to become visible. We're invisible indigenous people, and in our revolt, we wear masks, which make us visible. Well, these are high-vis vests. These are visible vests. So they make everyone visible in a crowd. So when you're blocking a motorway here, it's a tactic where they open up these are the tolls for the motorway where you pay, and they open it up, so they give free car journeys for people. It's a really good, very popular form of revolt when you give people free access to the motorway, and you make the multinational pay for it. The meme has gone everywhere onto dogs. It's even been flying from drones, different ways of blocking the roads. different ways of blocking the pay for this is the pay booth for a motorway, and they turned it into a boulodrome to play boule, the classic French game. And of course, like any insurrection, the creativity comes in that moment. I mean, everyone becomes a designer in an insurrectionary moment. Everyone designs disobedience. So the collective intelligence is extraordinary. So you've got, you know, how to use shopping carts to block a supermarket. There's been hundreds of millions of pounds of losses in France over the last 3 weeks. Hundreds of millions of pounds lost due to the economy. Used to cover the radars. And I found this photo absolutely extraordinary. In a way, I'll talk about this later, but this idea of action and representation. So this is someone who is in action, is rioting, but at the same time, he's representing the riot that he's involved in. So he or she is filming and live streaming while active. So this is the kind of journalism I like, Bernardo. Good journalism. So the political imaginary of this movement is really interesting. We were from where we set up a party for people in our local city who were Yellow Jackets, and we set it up, and we had a sound system. This was 2 days ago. We had the sound system and so on. And at one point, they come to me and go, "Oh, can you put the Marseillaise on?" which is the kind of national anthem. So we're mostly kind of, you know, coming from a kind of anarchist, anti-state background, and we're like, well, it's going to be a bit difficult to put the Marseillaise on our sound system. It's not really our culture. So we had a bit of a, you know, interesting argument. These are people who are totally not politicized. And then someone came to me and said, look, the reason they wanted the Marseillaise is because, and he was an activist, these people weren't. He said, it's not because they're fascists or they're nationalists. It's because their imaginary is not May 68, it's the revolution. They really believe this is a second French Revolution, and that's the imaginary where they're going, and the king is Macron, and they want his head. So what's happening at the same time as this is to kind of give the context of of what's going on at the moment, is, of course, the climate summit. And as you'll see, we've done a lot of projects against the corporate takeover of the climate summits. This is the UN climate summit that's happening in Katowice in Poland. 24 years of kind of climate summits, and, you know, to be honest, not a lot has changed except a kind of discourse by the governments. And this summit is sponsored by coal companies, of course, and it was opened by the famous British filmmaker David Attenborough, who said, the collapse of civilization is on the horizon. Now, his answer to the collapse of civilization was a Facebook bot called, that the UN has designed, called Act Now Bot, which helps people discover simple everyday actions so that they can tackle climate change. Unfortunately, it's not really simple everyday actions that are going to tackle climate change. Again, it's the same as, you know, putting tax on cars, even the same as me not flying. I don't see not flying as a political act. I see it as just a coherent act. It's not a political act because the plane's going to go anyway. The political act is actually a question of the system and capitalism. I mean, one thing that David Attenborough clearly didn't say was that 70% two-thirds of all the CO2 in the atmosphere since the start of industrial capitalism is by 90 companies. It's 90 companies that are responsible for all that CO2. It's not our individual lifestyle questions. And of course, what he didn't say is that climate change is a war on the poor. It's a direct war. It's always the poor who are going to suffer from the effects and the false solutions put in place by states and capitalists. And in the end, they will put money in front of life. So what it feels to me is that what's happening in Europe at the moment, and the Yellow Jackets itself, this grassroots movement, which is really blocking the economy. I mean, they've said, we block the economy in the weekdays, we attack the governments at the weekends. That's what they've said they're doing. And it's kind of opened up the fracture line, I think, between the climate crisis and justice. And I think this is really the fracture line that will take us into the next century. This is the fracture line that we have to deal with in the years to come. How do we survive, and how do we meet the needs of social justice? And in such moments of apocalypse, where only apocalypse seems to be on the horizon, what do we do as artists? What do we do as designers? What do we do as storytellers, theatre makers? And how can we collectively inspire a radical imagination? So I'm going to propose a few principles based on my experience as an artist and activist over the last 25 years with various collectives, but particularly the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination, which is a collective that I founded with my partner, Isabelle Frémaux. We founded it in 2004. And the idea is to bring artists and activists together, and as we say, to design disobedience against the economy of death. The idea is that artists have a tendency to be, and these are generalizations, of course, have a tendency to be extremely creative, to think outside of the box, to think poetically, to think metaphorically, to push the right brain, etc., but have a tendency to be very egotistical and not very coherent between their politics and their everyday life. Whilst activists tend to be a bit more coherent between their politics and everyday life, have a lot of courage, not very egotistical, generally have an experience of working collectively, but tend to have a lack of creativity, tend to always think the same creative forms. Oh, we'll have a camp. Oh, we'll have a blockage. Oh, we'll give out leaflets. Oh, we'll do a poster. Oh, we'll have a riot. It's often the same form. So for us, the idea is how do you bring these together in a kind of workshop atmosphere, often very active physical workshops, to create new forms of civil disobedience. The idea, of course, is to break down these definitions between artists and activists. We think that the artist, in a way, has this monopoly of creativity, which is very problematic, and the activist itself, which suggests that other people aren't creative, and the activist, her or himself, have a kind of monopoly of social change, which means that everyday life people don't change society. And both these positions and these identities are problematic in a sense. So we've done many, many different projects which range from making disobedient machines, of bicycle machines, including this, which had 5 pirate radio stations on it. And it would go into the street with lots of other bikes with radios on to create a kind of symphony, disobedient symphony in the streets, to more very simple projects where, like this one, where we called for a snowball fight after the crash of 2008 of the people against the bankers in the financial district of London. And we just made a call out, and people came and had a snowball fight to see who would win, the people or the banksters. We won. So I'm just going to give some principles. A series, I think there are 15 principles. So number 1, give up representation of all kinds. We're not interested in making art about the issues. We're not interested in making paintings about war, theatre pieces about climate change, installations about biodiversity loss. Neither are we really interested in simply doing what very traditionally graphic designers or artists do for political movements, is to do the graphic designs, is to kind of decorate the movements. We do that. This is a flyer we did for the climate camp, but it's not the kind of main part of our practice. It's very much a side thing. It's not what we think is the most important thing. An example, for example, is during the COP21, the climate conference in Paris in a few years back, 3 years ago now. An artist, Olafsson Ellison, did this piece where he brought huge pieces of ice to Paris and people watched them melt. They were ice brought from the Arctic. For us, this is absolutely problematic in a time of climate crisis. So while these ice things were melting, we had spent a year setting up a project that was called the Climate Games. We had brought, the slogan of the Climate Games was, "We are nature defending itself," and the idea was we spent a year in different cultural centers bringing together artists, hackers, activists, designers, and so on, to design a game that was a direct action game on the streets of Paris and the world during the climate negotiations. And the idea was there was a mapping software, and it was all anonymous, and you would choose your target, you would find a climate criminal, and then you would go and do an action and put a report up. But there was a series of prizes. So there was the most funny action, there was the most solidarity action, the most effective action, and so on. And there was a big prize-giving ceremony at the end, and the prizes were voted by the users. And in the end, about 120 teams took part. There was about 225 actions. This was all despite the state of emergency that had been put in France just before the COP21 because of the terrorist attacks. So the whole project was quite complicated, to say the least. But the actions ranged from, this was the Belgians who won the top prize. They went into the Volkswagen shops where they sold Volkswagen cars and had a sound system with Vivaldi's four seasons, and brought with them loads of seasons, so the leaves and so on, and did these extraordinary kind of weird choreographies which completely disturbed the Volkswagens. Worth looking them up. They're called the EZLN, the Zoologique. Can't remember their Belgian name, but they're very funny. We also produced one team produced hundreds of these and posters, and 600 bus stops were opened up, and then a poster put in talking about climate and so on. One of the teams printed the climate report onto toilet paper, went into the conference and replaced all the toilet rolls with the UN climate report in the conference center of the UN. Another team hid a pirate radio station in their crutches. They really had a problem, and they really were on crutches, so it was really turning the problem into the solution. Climbed up the Eiffel Tower and set up a pirate radio station with this as his antenna on the top of the Eiffel Tower. And meanwhile, also people were blocking the biggest machines in Europe, in the biggest CO2 production in Europe, which are the open cast coal mines in Germany. So for us, politics has a tendency to be incredibly boring. Of people marching from A to B with a message, normally a negative message, saying, no, we don't want war, we don't want patriarchy, we don't want fascism or whatever. And there's also a tendency within the left to think that if only we give people enough information, so if we tell them how many, how the support the far right is going, show them the graphs of the climate, of the temperature of the world going up, or showing that the fact that, every day 200 species are extinct forever, which is true. Tomorrow there'll be 200 less species on this planet than there were today. We can give all that information. And the left often thinks that if you give enough information, people will act. And we think this is absolutely wrong, and it's absolutely clear that this doesn't happen. We're very inspired by Stephen Duncan, who wrote this fantastic book called Dream, Reimagining Progressive Politics in an Age of Fantasy. And he talks about the importance of fantasy and desire. In the end, it is fantasy and desire that change people, not information. And he writes, politics is not solely or even primarily about reasoned thinking and rational choices. It's an affair of fantasy and desire. People are rarely moved to action, support, or even consent by realistic proposals. They're motivated by dreams of what could be. Capitalism knows this stuff. Capitalism knows how to touch our right brain, knows how to touch our desires, our fantasies, our emotions. So for us in the lab, the question is, and I saw it coming up in the discussion this afternoon, is how do you make radical politics as sexy as capitalism? That's the question. How do you make radical politics as sexy as capitalism? 2, enact prefigurative politics. What does prefigurative politics mean? Prefigurative politics means the world that you resist at the same time you show the world that you want. So, for example, I was very lucky to be in a collective called Reclaim Streets in the 90s, and we were an anti-car group. We saw that the streets were the commons of the city, commons that had been privatized by the car. The car, if you look at all the sociology, you see the more cars there are in streets, the less neighbors talk to each other, and therefore it's a process of privatization of the commons as everywhere. One of the things we wrote was the pollution of capitalism is much more the streets are as full of capitalism as they are of cars, but the pollution of capitalism is much more insidious. So we were an anti-capitalist, anti-car group, but instead of just having marches against cars, we said we will have street parties. We will have parties where we show people what a street can be without cars. And so this was the first one in 1995, and we had, it was a mixture of, the group had a mixture of ravers and artists and activists and ecologists and anarchists. And we were very influenced by the rave scene at the time. And we would use similar techniques. So, for example, here we would go into the metro. The police radios didn't work in the metro in those days. So we'd go into the metro from one place, which was the meeting place, which was public. Everyone knew the meeting place. And then we'd turn up out into the city at a secret location. And at this location, it was in Camden, there were 2 cars driving along. And at one point, these cars crashed into each other, and people jumped out of the cars and started to have a kind of road rage situation, shouting at each other. And then one person opened the boot of her car, and she brought out hammers, and the other person opened his boot and brought out paint, and they started to smash each other's cars up. And of course, this was street theater, but it was to block the street from the other cars. And this happened just as 500 people came out of the metro and started the street party. And the idea of the street party was fundamentally about pleasure. Politics has to be about pleasure, has to be about giving people fun, has to be about having a sense of a party. It was central to what we were doing here, was actually showing the street without cars, but also showing that politics could be fundamentally about pleasure. The street party meme started to develop more and more because it was a very simple idea. You bring a sound system, you invite people to the street, you never ask permission, you take the street and you have a party. And so street parties started to happen in different parts of the world. We started to get a bit kind of cocky and arrogant, so we thought, fuck it, let's take a motorway. So we took a motorway 3 years later. And 8,000 people went onto the motorway. And one of the big lessons that, for me, during this action was always be audacious. And during this action, we had these carnival figures going up and down the motorway, and hidden underneath the carnival figures, but hidden from the view of the police, were people with jackhammers who were drilling into the tarmac and planting trees. So hidden under the skirts, they were planting trees in the tarmac. And this very simple, symbolic action the story started to spread it was the early days of the internet. And what was super interesting is that it inspired people who normally we would never work with. It inspired the dockers, who were traditional Marxist workers on strike, dockland workers in a port, and they had heard this story. And for me, this made me think that audacious imagination and good stories break class boundaries. They totally break class boundaries, and you can actually start to work in new compositions, new coalitions with people if you have those stories. And they'd heard this story, and they decided to work with us. And it was very much the beginning of the early days of the ultimate globalization movement. And as the fantastic feminist, anarcho-feminist Bolivian group Mujeres Creando say, be careful with the present that you create, because it should look like the future that you dream. So, prefigurative politics. 4, adventure is addictive. You give people a sense of adventure, they want to come back for more and more and more. I mean, it's the basis of the theme park and roller coasters in a way. It's also a more spectacular version of in terms of action movies. And it comes back to this question of pleasure. Brecht said, our theatre must train people in the pleasure of transforming, of changing reality. We were involved as organizers in the climate camps. This was a climate camp in 2000 and, I don't remember, 8, 9, does it say? 8, yes, thank you. And climate camp was a very simple idea. There were self-managed camps. You would squat a piece of land that was near a climate infrastructure project or some kind of climate crime. You would have the camp. There would be several thousand people. The camp was totally self-organized. You would have workshops. All the camp had was renewable energy, and then you would have an action at the end, a direct action at the end. And so this was against a coal-fired power station that existed, and they wanted to build a new one, a new, bigger one next door. So we were like, well, you have to shut this one down, and you're not going to build a new one. So the action that we designed was to take the power station by air, by sea, and by land. And different groups took different elements. We took the sea, and we designed a thing called the Great Revel Raft Regatta, the GRE. And the idea of the GRE was that affinity teams would get together. We would then give them a treasure map, and the treasure map would show them where we had buried a boat in the forest with a bottle of rum, very important pleasure principle. And then they would go into the forest. They would spend the night in the forest. They would have found their boat with the treasure map. And at 7 a.m. in the morning, despite the fact that the police the day before had said that all boats on the river were illegal that day, about 150 people took to the sea, or took to the river, and the police brought out their big yellow helicopter. Most of us were arrested and then released pretty much immediately afterwards, but one boat actually made it into the power station and blocked the power station for a third of the power station. And many of the people here, 3 of the people here, this was their first ever direct action. They had never done this before. And those 3 now are still very, very involved, and they all say that that moment of pleasure and adventure was key to them. The adventure and the playfulness of all taking the boats and finding them and so on. The plans for the power station a few years later was shelved, and this is now what happened. We didn't do this, but the government did this, but it was nice to see. So now there's no power station there, and oops, sorry. So 5, this is very obvious for all of those of you who are doing storytelling and so on, but reframe their story. So during the climate camp of 2009, we made a climate camp on Heathrow, where they wanted to build the 3rd runway of Heathrow. And of course, because we were a movement that was winning, they were criminalizing us, and so they were using terror laws against us. So what did we do? We tried to reframe their laws. So they said we had weapons and that we were armed, and so on the day of action, we did this. We said, yes, we are armed, but we're armed only with peer-reviewed science. And we had the IPCC reports. People had it in their hands like this, and we made shields with the portraits of people who would be affected by climate change. The shields were for many reasons. One, because we knew we would have to push through police lines, and then the images of the media would be of people, of breaking these faces, which is actually what the police are literally doing by stopping climate action, anti-climate actions happening. And inside the shields, we hid 1-minute tents. And the 1-minute tents were then used to blockade the headquarters of the people who were going to build the airport. The shields later on, funny enough, ended up in the museum of the Victoria and Albert a museum in an exhibition called Disobedient Objects, and on the front page of Creative Review. Another story is that Never Go Home, and the Heathrow runway was cancelled. They cancelled it in 2000 and something, 9, 10. And then this year, so 9 years later, they brought it back. The government brought it back. So never go home. It's so easy to win and then think, oh, great, we've won. And then 10 years later, 9 years later, whatever, the same thing comes back. Number 7, don't pretend to do politics in the art world. As I'm sure you're very aware, it's very trendy, has been for the last decade or more, to do radical political exhibitions. This was actually not so bad, this one. At the Jeu de Paume in Paris, it was called Uprisings. They tend to be about representation, and as a friend and art critic, Brian Holmes, says, basically what I have to say here is simple. When people talk about politics in an artistic frame, they're lying. So it's a bit provocative, but I'll tell you a story about people lying. So we were invited to do a workshop at the Tate Modern, the big contemporary art museum in London. It was part of a series around revolution, and they put us on the front page of their website. They were super happy to have us. We called it Disobedience Makes History. That was the name we gave to the workshop. And it was going to be 2 weekends, and at the end of the weekend, an intervention in public space. I'm like, great. We get an email a week before the workshop, and they say, fantastic, we got the room, we got the video projector, we got 30 people enrolled, it's really great. We're really happy, we've got the coffee machine. Oh yes, but just one thing. Ultimately, it's also important to be aware that we cannot host any activism directed against Tate and its sponsors. However, we very much welcome and encourage a debate and reflection on the relationship between art and activism. Well, debate and reflection are the key words in the art world. It's okay to debate, it's okay to reflect, it's not okay to act. So, who weren't we allowed to act against? Well, actually, we're not able to act against not Arnold Schwarzenegger, but actually someone, this is John Brown. He was the CEO of British Petroleum, one of the biggest oil companies in the world, and also happened to be on the board of the Tate, because British Petroleum sponsored the Tate. In fact, oil companies sponsor most of the museums in London. Most of the public museums are sponsored by either Shell or BP. Now, why do they sponsor museums? It's not because they want to get you to buy petrol, because people buy petrol anyway. It's nothing to do with that. It's what's called the social license to operate. Basically, it's a way of saying the people who go to museums tend to be the elite, tend to be the diplomats, tend to be the people in research, and it's basically for that audience to say, look, we're funding culture, we can clean our dirty stain. You can forget that actually wherever we go and dig for oil, we set walls up. You can forget that, you know, we are causing possibly the extinction of the 6th greatest extinction. And so it's called a social license to operate, and it's part of their PR work, in a sense. So we thought, great, that email, it's the best pedagogical tool we've ever been given. So we start the workshop with people drawing images of disobedience, of their experience of disobedience, and then we give a talk about the relationship between disobedience and art, and at the end of the talk, we project the email onto the wall. Now, we don't say, you know, oh, she, the curator, wrote it. We say, the Tate has asked us this. And seeing as the workshop was called Make Disobedience History, it was pretty perfect. We were like, well, do we obey or disobey this demand of the Tate? So we do these exercises where you have a line, and we say one end is yes, one end is no, And so do we obey, yes or no? And you place yourself on the line, depending on where you think. And then you have a discussion. And the students were super kind of perturbed by this question. They were like, they thought the Tate was this kind of liberal, progressive art institution. And then in the end decided, despite the fact that the curators were trying to sabotage it all the time, decided, yes, they would do an action, and we would talk about it for the next week. And we would talk online about it and design it online, and then next week have a day to design it and then do it. We get a phone call. I think we need to talk. Could you come to the Tate? So I go. Isa was working at the time, so I go to this meeting. There's 4 new curators, the head of security, the head of public relations, the head of the publics, all around this table, and for 4 hours, the whole thing is, you cannot do an action against the Tate. If you do an against BP, if you do an action, we will close down your workshop. And I'm fantastic. That's so great, because if you close down the workshop, it will be the best pedagogic tool for the students to realize that the cultural institutions are completely linked into capitalist structures, and you become a police force as well, so it's fantastic. So at that moment, I also realized that you had to do principle number 8, which is abandon your cultural capital. At that moment, when we said that, we realized that we would never, ever get re-invited to the Tate. We would never get our, the retrospective of the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination or whatever bullshit. And that was really about saying, yes, we're going to abandon our cultural capital because for us, the politics and the climate and climate justice are way more important than an art career. So the students, in the end, do a very, very simple action because actually the curators really try and sabotage the second day of the workshop. They never close it down, but they're really trying to sabotage it. And so all they do is they do a big thing on the top of the Tate that says art, not oil. But what happens is that literally 90 days later, the Deepwater Horizon happens. BP's rig blows up in the Gulf of Mexico, and 3.19 million barrels of oil are poured into the Gulf of Mexico, causing enormous human suffering and ecological and species suffering. It's one of the world's biggest, largest oil paintings, and it happens that at the same time, a week later, BP are going to have a party to celebrate their funding of the Tate Museum. So we're like, great. And so we turn up to the party. We spill a lot of molasses. Some people go inside the party and have molasses hidden under their skirts, and they open up their skirts and then make the molasses go all over the floor, and then pick up the molasses with their high-heeled shoes, saying, oh, it's a very big museum. There's only a bit of oil. It's not a problem, which was a direct reference to the CEO of BP at the time. He said, oh, the Gulf of Mexico is huge. It's not a big spill. The issue starts to have a debate, and the students set up a group called Liberate Tate. And it then works for 7 years to try and get BP out of the Tate, doing incredible actions, which ranged from using the law. In Britain, you have a law that says if you find a kind of valuable painting in your grandma's attic, you can bring it to the museum, and the museum has to accept it, to look at it, and then can decide to keep it as a gift to the nation or give it back to you. So we thought, great, we'll use this law. So we brought a 16.5 meter long, 1.5 ton wind turbine blade and brought it to the Tate. And gave it to them with all the paperwork saying, look, this is a gift to the nation. And we left it in the Tate. We set up an illegal, they set up an illegal tattoo parlor in the Tate and tattooed onto people the ppm, which is the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this was tattooed onto people's bodies. So the older you are, the slower your ppm is. So the ppm now is 411. When I was born, it was 200 and something. Another principle is the least change for greatest effect. One of the actions they did was very, very simple. They put a body covered in molasses, naked body, in the museum, illegally again. And I think the action cost 30 euros, and it got front page of the Financial Times, 5 minutes on the national TV. So least effort, maximum gain. Really, 30 euro action, very simple. In 2016, after 7 years of illegal performances, the Tate dropped their funding. We've now gone and trained other people around Europe. In Holland, they set up a similar campaign against the Van Gogh Museum, and this year, the Van Gogh Museum dropped Shell sponsorship as well. And there's also a similar group in Paris against the Louvre. 10, become the territory. So we live in a society where mobility is the value. The great value is that you're mobile. You can say on your CV, I've done workshops in Hong Kong, Budapest, I've had exhibitions in Cairo, and so on. For us, we think that you're not going to get proper democracy until we have a society which doesn't value mobility, but which values actually getting to know somewhere, spending time somewhere, getting to know your home, getting to know the place that you live. We used to live here in London, and we realized that we thought it was no longer possible as revolutionaries to live in a metropolis. We thought that actually the metropolis always brings you back to the human life, that you're completely unable to have any reference of any other form of life bar the human, and that to live with very little money and to live and try to build a post-capitalist life seemed to us impossible in London, and we think in the metropolis in general. We also think as artists and designers, it's impossible to live in a city without becoming part of a gentrification process. And we wanted to refuse that. We didn't want to be part of a gentrification process. So we spent 7 months on a journey throughout Europe, and, oops, sorry. Oh, I haven't got the slide. And we went to 11 utopian communities in Europe and wrote a book and a film about it. And at the end of it, we left our jobs, we left our lives in London and moved to rural France. But we still were doing a bit of traveling. We were still going to do exhibitions and so on. And one exhibition project we did was at Kampnagel, a cultural center theater in Germany, in Hamburg. And we did a project, part of the project was called Fear Me No More, which was a 10-day permaculture, art, and activism training for young people and unemployed people. And at the end of it, there was a performance. And the performance involved, at the end, the audience coming onto the stage and having a debate about the ethics of sabotage. Was it okay to sabotage industrial capitalism? And the sabotage tools that they were being offered were ants. We had ants that are called the crazy raspberry ants that go into computers because they have 2 queens, they need to find many nests. They're attracted to the electronic vibrations of the computers, and computers are perfect as ant nests. They go in, but then they get electrocuted, and then all the other ants come, and it creates a short circuit. They've already closed down Houston Airport and have been a problem for NASA. So the idea was to give these ants to the audience if they wanted, and the audience would then go in these costumes, which were edible costumes that were growing costumes, and then they would go and put the ants into the banks of Hamburg. Another part of the project, however, was we love mushrooms, not just magic mushrooms. We love them because they're recyclers of death and composters. They're the kind of basic, we think they're the basis of much of life. We love mycelium, we love the network notion. If anything is radical democracy, it's mushroom and mycelium structures. And so we wanted to make a curtain of living mushrooms that the audience would eat before going out onto a boat, which would then take them to the bank where they would put the ants in. It was a huge, crazy project. So to make a curtain, it's an 8 by 9 meter theater curtain, we had to do the flour, do the straw, wet it for 10 days, huge project. And then we lifted it up with the theater technicians. It took a whole day to get the curtain up. And then what happens with mushrooms is that it's called pinning. After 10 days, you have a little tiny toot, and then 3 days later, they go zoom. And they pinned, and we were like, yes, it's going to work. And then there was a heat wave. And there was a heat wave in Hamburg, and the mushrooms said, we don't give a fuck about your cultural calendar. We've got our own biological calendar, and we ended up with a moldy curtain. We wanted the curtain to look like flesh. We tried it on a miniature scale. It looked beautiful, and we ended up with this moldy curtain. And we were super, super depressed. The project was all a bit of a mess anyway. It's a longer story. We got home, and at the time we were living in this tent on a farm in Western France. And we got home, and someone had opened the door of our tent, and there were mushrooms growing all over the roof of our tent. And we kind of realized that it was a big reminder that the mushrooms were telling us something very clear. You don't have to go and do your 40,000 euro budget theatre pieces. You can stay at home, and the mushrooms grow here. You can become the territory. John Berger wrote, to improve something, you really need to know the texture, the life story of that thing. And that means giving it attention. And for us, the definition of art is we think anything can be art as long as it simply gives attention to something. For us, that's the definition. Giving attention to something. Giving attention to the way you make a meal, run a workshop, cut someone's hair, design a space, design an action, and so on. Simply a question of attention. And often that means becoming the territory. 10, merge the yes and the no. We think that you have to, what we call the DNA of revolution, the revolutionary DNA, is when you have the yes and the no together. You merge creating and resisting. You merge alternatives and resistance. We can do all the community gardens we want. We can build all the community wind farms and the commons we want. But if we don't stop burning fossil fuels in the next few years, then all those gardens, all those community wind farms will either be flooded or will be in a desert, and it makes no sense. So for us, you have to block the capitalist fossil fuel industry at the same time as creating an alternative. You have to merge these things together. If you're just in protest, then you end up just burnt out, and people generally prefer a positive alternative than a resistance. And if you're simply in the alternative, then one of the big lessons is the lesson from Silicon Valley during the 70s. So in the 70s, there were about 8 million people living in communes in the US. And there was a split between those who were against the system and those who wanted to create their utopias. And that split was pretty profound. And what happened is through various, particularly individuals, the kind of hippie communes ended up becoming part of Silicon Valley. And the whole culture that we now know as, as social networks and so on came from the hippie values. But because they forgot who the enemy was, because they were no longer in resistance, then they ended up working with the military, the government, the very people that 30 years later they would never have dreamt of working with. And so we feel very privileged to be living in a place where exactly this is happening, where this mixture of resistance and alternative was happening. This is our house here. It's a squat. It's just near Nantes in France. And this is a whole wetland where they wanted to build an airport with two runways, and this is the airport buildings. It's an airport that's been struggled against for 50 years. It began with peasants struggling against it, saying, we want to keep this land as food land. We want this land to keep for peasants and nourishing land. And in 2009, the first French climate camp, inspired by the English climate camp, set up against the airport. And what began was the ZAD, the Zone to Defend, Zone à Défendre. And the idea was people started to squat the land, squat the empty buildings, and the project was no longer just about the airport, but against its world, against the world that the airport represented, the world where life comes after money, the world where you manage territory to control people and forms of life. And so people started to squat the land, to work with farmers, and through a whole period, this 4,000 acres of, so 1,650 hectares of land became a kind of huge open-air commune, post-capitalist squat and commune, with no building permissions and so on, with extraordinary houses, extraordinary forms of vernacular architecture made from the wastes of the world. Even on the roads, so we took over the roads, and even this is a medieval barn built using medieval techniques. And so our own hay production, bakeries, honey. It's France, so of course we've got radical camembert, pirate radio stations, a newspaper, and about 300 people live in about 70 different communes, and made decisions together and tried to live a post-capitalist life despite capitalism, whilst at the same time blocking the infrastructure project. In 2012, another principle coming up here is diversity of tactics. So in 2012, the French state decided to evacuate the zone to build their airport. And an incredible resistance takes place, which mixes really old people, young people, farmers, activists, non-activists, local villagers. And what made us win at this moment was the diversity. There was non-violent forms, there was burning barricades, there was singing, there was naked people going in through the woods to try and show their vulnerability. There were Vikings, you've always got to have a Viking. There was mud used. And this diversity of tactics meant that a month later, 40,000 people turned up and rebuilt the houses that they had destroyed during that eviction. They destroyed 12 houses during that eviction, and 40,000 people turned up and collectively rebuilt a hamlet. It was an extraordinary, extraordinary moment. And the hamlet was then surrounded. There was two parts of the hamlet. This was a smaller part, there was a bigger part over here. And it was surrounded by tractors of the farmers for many weeks. And the police left the zone. They realized they couldn't evict it. They were very scared of killing someone. They realized they didn't want to kill someone. The resistance was so powerful that they realized that they had to leave the zone. And so for 6 years, we lived on a territory run by its people, and with no police, no judges, no bailiffs, no members of the government, no MPs ever coming onto this territory. It really became what the French state called a zone de non-droit, a kind of outlaw zone. But it became a commons with loads of different projects, ranging from rap studios to breweries, etc. And then in 2016, they really wanted to build it. And so we said, well, no, you're still not going to build the airport. We put 20,000 people onto the main bridge that goes across Nantes with 500 tractors and 1,000 bicycles, and had a big banquet on the bridge. A month later, we had a big party on a motorway with 60,000 people on the motorway. And then in October, another principle coming, the power of ritual. So in October, we invited people to come with a walking stick, and there was a whole symbolic tradition of the walking stick, which I haven't got time to go into now, and to put the walking stick in the ground and pledge that they would come back and get their walking stick if the government came to take the land and build the airport. And 40,000 people came, 20,000 people put their walking sticks in. And at the same time, we were building exactly on where I live, in the house where I live, is where they wanted to put the control tower, and we decided, as an act of kind of ritual magic, we would build not a control tower, but a lighthouse. And so we built a fully working lighthouse exactly where they wanted to put the control tower. The story is a long one, I haven't got time to go into it, but in January 2018, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe went onto TV and cancelled the airport, and we won. But in the same breath, he said, and this is a very important thing to remember, he said that he would evacuate the outlaw zone. So why? We had won against the airport, 50 years of struggle. They weren't going to build the airport, but they were going to evacuate. And why were they going to evacuate? As David Graeber, the anarchist anthropologist, says, he says, the system puts 50% of its time into reproducing itself, reproducing capitalism and the state and so on, and it puts 50% of its time into making absolutely sure that no alternatives to the state and capitalism can exist or be visible or are seen as totally ridiculous. And even though this is just 1,650 hectares, 300 people, 70 squats, it was showing that it was possible to live without the state. And Graeber says, you know, governments, they don't mind demonstrations and so on, a bit of rage. What they hate is when people say, we can live without you, and you are ridiculous, and this is what we paid for. So in April this year, we were met with 4,000 police, 2 tanks, 4 drones, and they fired 11,000 tear gas canisters at us, which has just been beaten. The record was beaten last weekend in the Arc de Triomphe, actually. And this is our democracy space. This is where we have all the meetings, which was destroyed. They destroyed many of the farms. They destroyed 40 places, basically. The resistance was very, very strong. Again, it was a massive diversity of resistance, but they still managed to destroy our homes, including some of the really incredibly beautiful, beautiful things. And one of the most beautiful moments of resistance was when we built, during this was happening, we built this out of the wood from our forests using traditional carpentry, and this to replace the dome where we would used to have the meetings, to have a new meeting hall, and we carried it with 200 people through 4 kilometers to try and put it, and we put it there, but the police came and destroyed it the day later. Now, basically, they are forcing us to legalize. Many people have left, but many of us are still there, and we're still there, and we're still trying to do what we can by hacking their laws and so on. But for us, the most important thing, and the aesthetic question, is this. For us, the aesthetic thing is that the wetland is not an airport, that life will continue to reproduce itself. Life will continue to go into the evolution which creates more freedom, which creates more diversity, which creates more relationships. And the fact is that, for us, is the aesthetic question. The aesthetic question is that this will remain a wetland and won't be a piece of concrete. And to end, a quote from Alan Capro, who says, "We may see the overall meaning of art change profoundly from being an end to being a means, from holding out a promise of perfection in some other realm to demonstrating a way of living meaningfully in this one." Great, thanks.
Any question? Well, congratulations for the presentation. Well, I have a question about the yes and the no at the same time. I think it's quite poetic. I would like to know more examples. Okay, if they're resisting and the creation at the same time, but it's not usual. I mean, it's always, or you are resisting or you're creating. So, or do you have any tip or more examples of that? Or
for us at the ZAD, one of the best examples and the most inspiring, of course, is the Zapatista uprising in Mexico, in Chiapas, where we're just about to hit the 25th anniversary, where the indigenous people have set up their own form of government, of self-government, and are at the same time resisting the Mexican state by taking the land and so on. So that, for us, is an example. The movement Sem Terra in Brazil, landless peasant movement in Brazil that take thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hectares of land from the rich land owners and turn it into farms for landless peasants. And there, again, they resist, but they're also creating farms and forms of life. But you're right, it's rare. because it's dangerous. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's much better to divide, you know, the alternative folk who are doing all their kind of, you know, fab lab, hack lab, blah blah alternatives, and those who are resisting. It's much more effective for the continuation of the system, I think, to divide these two. And you know, I think the Occupy was you know, also a kind of yes and a no, and M15 was a yes and a no as well. In a way.
I have a small question just to make sure I understand. First of all, thank you very much, because it was really nice to see, and very you show a lot of courage on the things you've done and the reasons why. Just trying to understand how it links with democracy, in the sense of, I was thinking in an example, if there are 20 people blocking the entry to a commercial center, and there is 500 people trying to enter this place and another 100 trying to sell things, wouldn't the democracy say that this would rather happen than not, because more people agrees on the thing happening than the thing not happening?
I mean, I think it's a very key question to what, you know, radical democracy. I mean, if we look at Switzerland, with perhaps one of the most radical democracies in Europe, nearly in the world, you know, what do the citizens love to vote? They love to vote anti-immigration laws. They love to vote things that are really not necessarily what I, as someone from the kind of left, would necessarily want. So I think, you know, I think for me, you cannot separate democracy from, and this comes back to this idea of paideia, from actually building an ethical life. You know, that the ethics has to be embedded within the process of democracy. You can't just have democracy as this kind of machine and then think that the kind of cultural ethics of your society and the value systems of your society is kind of somehow a separate thing. Because of course you can have, you know, you could develop an incredibly racist, homophobic, sexist form of democracy if you created those values and then just used these mechanisms to put them in place if everyone agreed. And so for me, you cannot just, you know, it has to be a process of value making as well. And so in that instance, you know, does that make sense?
I have the feeling the values are different to everyone. I appreciate that yours are better than many other people's, but I think neglecting other people's, that will not help their values changing towards better. So, like, it's almost the same as neglecting what we would consider ethical values. So I wonder if actually labeling democracy something that is anarchical is really helping to the cause, or just devaluing a bit more the word if it hasn't been already enough.
What did you say at the end?
The thing is, using democracy for something that is maybe not according to what everyone thinks, or most of the people think, would even devalue make the word lose even more value that it has lost already. I still think that it has, the action has a value to make you realize things are happening, but calling it radical democracy, let's say, that doesn't transmit democracy to me somehow.
Yeah, I mean, all the actions I showed are part of collective processes, so, you know, everything had worked on a non-hierarchical level. And, you know, I think we do need, as I started with disobedience, and, you know, progress is made through conflict. And I think it was very interesting talking about the feminization of politics this afternoon, and reducing conflict within the space of democracy, and I think that's a great thing. And living in France, which is quite a macho, there's a kind of macho-ness within the radical left, and conflict is seen as this great thing, that you're in the assemblies and you have conflict, and that's how great new ideas come. And I think it's utterly rubbish, and I think it basically excludes most people from some process together. But at the same time, I don't think that means that you shouldn't necessarily have conflict within the society. Moments of conflict where, yeah, people are going to not agree. When slavery was abolished, most people thought that black people didn't have souls, and therefore slavery was fine. That was the democratic consensus at the time. And a few people said, well, no, actually, we don't believe that black people, we believe black people do have souls, and they're humans just like us, and therefore to enslave them is wrong. And therefore we're going to try and abolish slavery, and the slaves rose up themselves anyway. I think, same with, even democracy itself was brought in at a moment where the divine right of kings was seen as absolutely normal. It was absolutely normal that the king was chosen by God and ruled over everyone. But some people went, well, no. So, I think we have to be, it's a kind of dialectic between these moments of a shared culture and those moments where actually you're, trying to develop other values. And for me, the basic value is letting life live, in a sense, and basic sense of justice. But even that is complicated because you can talk about abortion and issues around that. So, even there you can't have a kind of clear value. And these things are situated, and I think we also have to constantly bring back the local, the situated, the contextual, and not have these values that are kind of overarching as well. I think it's also really important to bring in the situated.
Any question more?
I don't know if I did understood the point 4 that you say adventure is addictive, and you give an example about the boats and the. Could you explain it again, because I don't know if I got exactly what you exactly did and how it worked. I didn't understood because the English. Okay.
Okay. So we buried the boats. We had rubber boats that were buried in the forest. So at night, a week before, we dug holes in the forest and we put the boats under there. And then we had groups of people, affinity groups of like 5, 6 people, would then say, I'm a group and we want to have a boat. And then we would give them a treasure map. And then at night, they would go into the forest on the night of the day of the action, sleep the night there, and in the morning, and they would find their boat with the treasure map, and in the morning, and their bottle of rum, and in the morning, they would take the boat, all go out onto the river together, and then there was like thousands of police and helicopters and lots of speedboats with police in trying to stop us and everything, but one boat got into the power station and the power station had to shut down, half the power station, while the boat was there.
Okay, and how people did know that this was happening? How did you...
Because it was a climate camp. So it was already a camp where there were like 4,000 people camping for a week as this protest camp. So there was already a camp there. So it was within the context of this camp, which was very mediated, and the police completely surrounded it and searched everything, and you had to wait an hour to get in because they were searching everyone's cars, and they even didn't let us take in they took away people. We had life vests for everyone because it was super dangerous to be on the road without life vests. So we then had to hide the life vests somewhere else. So it became part of the adventure. So when people got the treasure map, we also said, you have to go to this station, this train station, which is like 20 kilometers away on the train, and you will meet a man reading a newspaper, and he will show you where a life vest is, and you'll then have to take the life vest. So, it was very complicated, but it worked in the end.
Yeah, okay.
Is that clearer?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I have another question. How long have you been living outside the system?
I don't think I live outside the system.
I mean, yeah.
We're very influenced by permaculture, which is inspired by looking at ecology, ecological systems, and looking at how ecosystems are designed, and then developing designs, principles based on ecosystems design. And one of those design principles is multiply the edges. And so in ecosystems, for example, between the sea and the land, or between a forest and a meadow, that is where you have the most relationships between different species. And therefore, it's where the engine of evolution happens. And we think that that's where change happens. You can't leave the system. I can't leave capitalism. I can't leave patriarchy, you know. But I can try and live on an edge and develop new forms of cultures on those edges. And I think that's where you can have an effect, in a way, on the edges between systems. I think if you're in the system, totally in the system, I think inevitably the system has a positive feedback mechanism, and you end up reproducing the system, even though millions of people go into the system and think, it's fine, I'm going to change the system. You know, Obama went into the system as a lawyer, a young black lawyer in the neighborhood, thinking he was going to change the system, and ended up being president of the United States and not changing the system. You know, we can see, you know, and I think in the municipal democracy culture that you have in Spain, I'm sure it's I know it's a huge debate, and I think inevitably you will see people who think they can change it within the system and inevitably become part of the system, because systems are very, very powerful. You reproduce the cultures and the values within them. It's this feedback mechanism. If you're totally outside the system, it's very hard to have influence, power. You're immediately seen as a kind of outlaw, da-da-da. So for me, that's why the edge is really interesting, you know. So that's why we, you know, sometimes work in the museums, and sometimes work in the squats, and sometimes work, you know. So for us, it's putting one foot in, and you influence each one like that. It's a kind of dance, but where you're on the edge.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I think we can have a break, 5 minutes, and we have more or less 1 hour. Maybe we can sit in the table to think, to get some tips from Jean, and later we can drink a beer.
Great.
Okay.